trail register at the Coldwater Creek trailhead goes back almost 20 years. Most entries are unremarkable: dates, names, estimated return times, the kind of information rangers use to track who's in the backcountry on any given day. We signed in on a Thursday morning in late August, 4 of us, planning a 3-night loop through the northern section of the wilderness area. Before we left the parking lot out of habit, I flipped back through a few pages of old entries. One of them stopped me. About 40 pages back, which the date column placed roughly 6 years earlier, someone had written their name, a solo trip, estimated return in 5 days. The handwriting was neat and deliberate. What made me pause was the entry directly below it, added in different handwriting, smaller and cramped: did not return. Search conducted. No contact. I mentioned it to the others. Our friend Joel, who had done the most backcountry of any of us, said missing persons in wilderness areas weren't uncommon: exhaustion, injury, bad navigation. He said the register note just meant a search had been conducted, not necessarily that anything sinister had happened. We signed in and started hiking. The first 2 days were unremarkable. Good weather, well-maintained trail, the particular kind of quiet that deep forest produces, not silence exactly, but a layering of sound that makes human noise feel conspicuous. We camped at designated sites both nights, saw no other hikers, felt completely at ease. On the 3rd day, we took a spur trail toward a ridge overlook that wasn't on our main route. About a mile off the primary trail, in a flat area between 2 large rock outcroppings, we found a campsite. Not a designated site. An improvised one, a fire ring built from stacked stones, a rough clearing where someone had leveled the ground by hand, a length of paracord strung between 2 trees at tarp height. The kind of setup someone makes when they plan to stay somewhere for longer than a night. The site had clearly been there for years. The fire ring stones were moss-covered and partially sunk into the ground. The paracord was weathered to the point of fragility, the outer sheath cracked and gray. A small pile of gear was stacked at the base of one of the rocks: a stuffed sack with a broken zipper, a single trekking pole with a bent tip, what had once been a food bag now reduced to shredded fabric, likely by animals over several seasons. Joel found the journal. It was tucked inside the stuffed sack, wrapped in a plastic bag that had partially preserved it. A standard small field notebook, the kind with the black and white marbled cover. Most of the pages were water damaged and illegible. The ink bloomed and spread until the words were unreadable. But the last several pages were in better condition, the ones closest to the back cover, the ones that had been written last. We read them. The entries were dated. The last readable ones were about 2 weeks after the sign-in date I'd seen in the trailhead register. The person, his name from the first legible entry, was Thomas, had apparently injured his ankle badly enough to prevent hiking out, and had made camp here to wait for the pain to subside. The early entries were practical: rationing food, keeping a fire going at night, descriptions of failed attempts to signal aircraft. The later entries were different. He wrote about sounds at night that he couldn't identify. Not animal sounds, he was specific about that, wrote that he knew what animals sounded like, and these were not that. He described a pattern of knocking, like wood striking wood, that moved around the perimeter of his camp in the dark. He wrote about waking up to find his gear rearranged, items moved from where he'd left them, his trekking poles crossed in a shape he hadn't made. One entry, written in handwriting noticeably less steady than the others, described seeing something at the edge of the tree line in the early morning. He wrote that it stood very still and that it was roughly the right shape for a person, but that the proportions were wrong in a way he couldn't specify. He wrote that it watched him for a long time before the light changed and he could no longer see it. The last entry was 3 words. It's still here. We stood around that camp for a while without speaking much. Joel suggested we should take the journal back to the ranger station, which was the right thing to do and which we did. The ranger on duty looked at it for a long time. He didn't seem surprised in the way you'd expect. He thanked us, made a note of where we'd found the camp, and said it would be added to the existing file. I asked him if Thomas had ever been found. The ranger said no. He said the original search had covered most of the area and turned up nothing. He said cases like that were unfortunately not rare in wilderness areas this size. He said it in the tone of someone who had given that answer before and believed it was true and also knew it wasn't the whole truth. We hiked out the next morning. I haven't been back to that wilderness area. I think about the last entry sometimes, those 3 words written in a hand that was trying to stay steady. I think about the fact that we camped 2 miles from that spot for 2 nights and slept fine, and I wonder what that means, and I try not to wonder too hard. There's a particular kind of fear that doesn't announce itself loudly. It comes in quietly through a detail that's almost right but not quite, something your body understands before your mind catches up. That's how it started on the second night of a camping trip I took with my brother in the Ozark National Forest 3 years ago. It had been his idea. Connor is 5 years older than me and had been camping in that area since he was a teenager, knew the trails, knew which sites were best, had a favorite spot along a creek that he'd been going back to for over a decade. He invited me for a long weekend in September when the heat breaks and the forest is at its best. I'm not an experienced camper, but I trusted him completely in that environment. He knew what he was doing. The first night was perfect. We set up camp in the early evening, made dinner over the fire, talked until the fire burned down. The forest around us was active in the way fall forests are, insects, the occasional animal movement in the brush, wind through the canopy. Normal sounds, easy to sleep through. The second night started the same way. Dinner, fire, conversation. Connor turned in around 10. I stayed up a little longer reading, then put the fire down to coals and got in my tent. I don't know what time it was when the sound woke me. Sometime deep in the night, no light visible through the tent walls, the coals probably long out. The sound that woke me was a voice. It was coming from the tree line on the far side of the camp, maybe 60 or 80 feet away. A man's voice pitched to carry without being loud. Calling a name. Calling Connor. I lay completely still and listened. The voice called his name again, same tone, same cadence, the way you'd call to someone you knew was nearby and expected to answer. I told myself it was another camper, lost in the dark, looking for a friend. I told myself the name was a coincidence. Then I noticed something that made the explanation fall apart. The voice sounded like Connor. Not exactly like him, close, the way a recording can sound close but carry something hollow that the real thing doesn't have. But the resemblance was specific enough that I couldn't dismiss it. Whatever was in the tree line was producing a version of my brother's voice and using it to call my brother's name. I unzipped my sleeping bag as quietly as I could manage and pulled on my boots. I grabbed my flashlight. I did not go outside. I leaned over and put my hand on Connor's tent and shook it once, hard. He came awake fast, years of outdoor experience, light sleeper. I heard him shift and then he said very quietly, "I hear it." We stayed still and listened together. The voice came twice more. Same name, same voice. Then nothing, a silence that felt abrupt, the way a sound stops when something realizes it's been noticed. Connor unzipped his tent and came out with his headlamp. He swept it across the tree line, nothing. He walked the perimeter of the camp slowly, lighting up the brush, checking every direction. Nothing there. We sat by the dead fire in the dark for a while. I asked him what he thought it was. He took a long time to answer. He said that when he was 19, camping alone in this same area, he'd heard something similar, a voice calling his name from the trees on his first night. He'd assumed it was a neighboring camper and hadn't thought much about it. But in the morning he'd found footprints in the soft mud near the creek that didn't match his boots and didn't lead anywhere he could follow. He said he'd never told anyone because he hadn't known what to tell them. We broke camp at first light and hiked out. Neither of us pushed to stay the third night. We didn't discuss it explicitly, we just both started packing at dawn without anyone suggesting it. On the drive home, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that I've turned over many times since. He said the thing that bothered him most wasn't the voice or the name. It was that both times, 19 years apart, two separate visits, whatever it was had used his voice to do the calling. He said it felt less like something trying to lure him and more like something that had been studying him. For a very long time. What I'm about to describe involves someone I know well, and I want to be careful about how I tell it because she's still alive and still doesn't talk about what happened. What I can tell you is what I witnessed directly before she went missing and the morning she came back. Her name is Diane. We've been close friends since college, both in our early 30s at the time this happened. She's an experienced hiker, decades of solo trips, multiple multi-day wilderness routes completed without incident. The kind of person who plans meticulously, carries the right gear, files detailed trip plans with the appropriate rangers. When she didn't check in on the third day of a solo week-long route in the Cascade Wilderness, everyone who knew her understood that something was genuinely wrong. The search began on day 4. Family, friends, search and rescue, a coordinated effort that covered the most likely sections of her planned route. Her car was at the trailhead. Her trip plan was on file. Every indication said she had gone in and not come out. I drove up and stayed in a nearby town with her sister for the duration. The search teams went out daily. They found her tent on day 6, set up at a designated campsite about 9 miles in, properly staked, sleeping bag inside, her pack leaning against a tree nearby with her food and navigation gear still in it. Her boots were inside the tent. That detail, her boots inside the tent, is the one that search and rescue said was hardest to account for. She knew that wilderness. She would not have walked away from camp in her socks. Not voluntarily. Not under any normal circumstances. 3 more days passed. The search area expanded. On the morning of the 9th day, a Forest Service employee doing a routine road check on a logging access road, about 14 miles from where her tent had been found, called in a report of a person walking along the road. It was Diane. She was walking steadily, wearing the clothes she'd had on when she left the trailhead 9 days earlier. No visible injuries. No signs of exposure that should have been present after 9 days in the backcountry in September. She was not disoriented. She knew her name, knew the date, or rather, she knew the date she had left, and when told that 9 days had passed, she was quiet for a long moment and then said she understood. She was examined at a hospital. Physically, she was in better condition than anyone expected: mild dehydration, some weight loss, nothing that indicated 9 days of exposure without shelter or food. No injuries consistent with a fall or physical trauma. No explanation for her bare feet, which showed callousing consistent with walking long distances, but no cuts or damage from 9 days on uneven forest terrain barefoot. I saw her the day after she was discharged. She looked like herself. She sounded like herself. When I asked what had happened, carefully, trying not to push, she said she didn't know how to explain it in a way that would make sense. I asked her to try. She said the last thing she remembered clearly was making dinner at her campsite on the 2nd evening. She said she remembered looking up from the fire and seeing the tree line go very still, not the normal stillness of night, but something she described as intentional. Like everything in the forest had stopped at once. She said after that she had no consecutive memory. Not blackness, not sleep, just fragments, disconnected, like photographs from different days laid out in no particular order. Firelight. Moving through trees in darkness without fear, which she found strange to recall because she said she should have been afraid. A sound she described as low and continuous, felt more than heard, that seemed to come from the ground itself. The sensation of being somewhere she couldn't describe, not underground, not outdoors, not any environment she had a word for. And then the logging road and walking, and the Forest Service truck pulling over. She said the 9 days felt like a few hours. She said she had no explanation for that and had stopped trying to find one. The detail she mentioned last, almost as an aside, is the one I haven't been able to put down. She said that in one of the fragments she could remember clearly, she was standing in a large open space. She couldn't see walls or ceiling, but somehow knew it was enclosed, and there were other people there. Standing quietly, spaced apart, all facing the same direction. She said she didn't know any of them. She said none of them looked frightened either. She has not been back to that wilderness area. She still hikes, still goes out solo, still plans her routes with the same precision she always did. She just doesn't go back there. I asked her once, about a year after it happened, if she thought she'd ever understand what occurred during those 9 days. She thought about it for a while and then said probably not. She said she'd decided that was okay. She said some things aren't meant to be understood from the outside. I've thought about those other people she described. Standing in a space she couldn't define, facing the same direction, not afraid. I wonder how long some of them had been there.